the reason for that is that, people see things that happen like the Terri Schiavo case in Florida from, a few decades ago, where somebody became incapacitated and ended up in the hospital without any sort of advanced medical directives. And there was disagreement over how that care should be continue on, who should be making those decisions, and lots of money is wasted in the fight. The person kind of languishes in the hospital for a long time while that fight works out. And so the idea from the secular legal perspective is like, okay, well, we're going to empower certain people, to make those decisions so that it can be handled properly. And the default, at least with living wills, is to basically put the hardest decisions in the hands of the doctors and say, doctors, once you've determined I'm medically hopeless and you think it's time to remove life support, notify my family so they all have time to say goodbye and make arrangements. But don't force them to sign off on it. Just, I'm giving you the discretion to make that call. Now, from a Catholic perspective, that is a problem because we can't really count on whatever random doctor is taking care of us at the end of our life to share our beliefs about the value of human life and what dying with dignity looks like, on the difference between extraordinary and ordinary means of keeping somebody alive.
Well, in the doctor's defense, why should we die with dignity if we don't live with it? Which seems to be the choice we're going.
Fair. Right. And also in defense of healthcare professionals, most of them kind of end up very cynical about these situations because it is possible to waste a truly gobsmacking amount of money with end of life interventions and to inflict a lot of needless suffering on somebody. So a lot of them, having been in the trenches on these issues for a long time and have seen some really horrific outcomes, they basically say like, hey, I want you to no code me. If it gets to the point where you need to take heroic interventions to try to keep me alive, just let me go. And I can totally understand how they end up there. But, as Catholics, we're coming at this with a 2,000-year-old, intellectual and theological tradition about human life being sacred, about there being, meaning and suffering, and needing to treat human life with the utmost delicacy because, it is a gift from God and it's not fully our decision to decide when it's time to punch out. So the way that I try to help Catholics plan around that is to basically explain to them what these various end-of-life documents do and explain instead that, here's what the church recommends, that, you don't have a DNR, you don't have a living will, because it's essentially trying to decide in advance what is going to be done in a very tricky situation that is going to require a lot of prudence to handle faithfully. So what the church recommends is that, you have a well-drafted Catholic healthcare power of attorney that nominates well-formed Orthodox Catholics to make that decision when the time comes, and not try to take the hands out of the decision out of the hands of those people and try to give advanced instructions ahead of time that are going to be applicable in every possible scenario that could ever happen.
I'm going to put Michael on the spot real quick. Michael, had you ever heard of the Terri Schiavo case? Terri Schiavo? It was a big deal in the first Bush administration, I think, wasn't it? And I actually had a chance to sit down with her brother, Bobby Schindler, and talk for about 45 minutes once. For those of our younger listeners who don't know, she was a woman who was in a persistent vegetative state in Florida and no kids, husband. And long story short, the husband and and her immediate family were at odds with whether to end her life or not. So, and he basically, if I'm not mistaken, he fell into a classic case that a lot of people think is okay. They think removing life support is the same as pulling food and water. And that seems to be one of the clearest not gray areas, but blind spots that most people have is that, oh, well, just pull food and water and then that's okay. That's not, but that's murder. And that's what they did in Terri Schiavo's case, I believe. Isn't that correct?
Yeah. And, maybe it'd be helpful to talk a little more about that and what the church's actual standard is. So the church defines ordinary care as interventions that have a reasonable hope of benefit for the patient and that do not impose, excessive burdens on the people involved, as far as like cost or, basically destroying a rare resource or something like that. And so the thing with food and water, even if it is artificially administered, is kind of the classic case where more secular way to look at this is that as soon as somebody's in a persistent vegetative state, they look at the odds that this person's going to come out and they're going to say, well, they're not going to come out. We are just going to remove all treatment. We're going to pull intravenous fluid, we're going to pull intubated food, all that kind of stuff, and just hasten their end, because otherwise we're going to be throwing good money after bad here. And the church's stance is that food and water is ordinary care that everybody needs. I mean, that's not even really a medical intervention, even if it has to be artificially administered. And it's important to continue that to maintain the dignity of that person. Now, there are a lot of other sorts of interventions that don't fall into that category. So, mechanical ventilation, intubated breathing, various sorts of resuscitation, CPR, there's a lot of stuff that the church is going to say is like, no, you don't have to do that under all circumstances. But, food and water is kind of like a very basic thing. And it's very dangerous to authorize people to basically withhold that arbitrarily, ensuring that the patient is going to either starve to death or dehydrate to death because someone somewhere made an arbitrary decision that their quality of life has fallen beneath some threshold, and now it's time to hasten their demise, because then we're treading into euthanasia territory.
It seems like you're trying to find a balance, preparing for the future of what we don't know what's going to happen. And then some people who are trying to prepare for a future and then doing it incorrectly. So like there's the people who are saying, oh, I don't want to have to deal with this. I don't have to put all these issues on my family where I'm in a vegetative state. So I'm going to put a DNR. And to them, they're thinking that they're doing something good, preparing family members or whoever to deal with this. Like what we're finding is, especially if you're Catholic, but I mean, obviously this is stuff that, even non-Catholics should be able to understand, that like why this might not be a good idea. So it's like really what your role is helping people find out what are the right things to do, because we do need to do things preemptively. We need to do things before they happen. And then what are the right things? So how do you guide people? Because I'm sure you don't have just Catholic clients, but how do you guide people who maybe are not fully Catholic or are not Catholic or have maybe a family where they're not all Catholics, to like guide them towards what you believe to be the right decision in terms of how you're preparing for these end of life issues?
That's a good question. A lot of attorneys, I feel, do kind of a bad job of explaining what the living will does. And the living will essentially is designed to cut the family out of that decision-making process. And, it really depends on how you frame that to the client. Because if you're going to try to sell it, you're going to say like, oh, these are very hard decisions to make. You really don't want to force your wife or your kids to have to sign off on the removal of life support. They might not have the emotional fortitude to do that. So if you sign the living will, you won't ever be putting them in that situation, and the doctors will just make decision for them instead. So even for non-Catholics, how I frame it for them is I say that, if you sign the living will, you are intentionally cutting your family out of that decision. And for some clients, they still want to do that because, they might have been through some traumatic experience with their own parents where the parents didn't have any kind of medical directives and the kids disagreed over what should happen. And it was a horrible situation for all involved.